So newly rejuvenated, I set out trying to fix that really bad empty problem that I got from the playtest. I had to revisit my goals, and for the first time I actually wrote them down. You heard me right, I spent this entire time without actually writing down the goals and constraints that I had. Now remember, I was doing all of this design before writing any of these podcasts. This is all done retrospectively. By writing these things down, I found a new commitment to them. They were all of a sudden much more concrete and real. I had something to reference. And it wasn't just something that was bouncing around in my head, ready to easily be forgotten at the next shiny little thing that I thought of. After writing everything down, I realized that my number one goal had to be exploration. So I wrote it down. I also started to write down all of the components in the game and tried to tie them to ways that they fit into that goal of exploration. I wrote down the map, and that was a pretty clear one. Players would choose where they wanted to go on their next adventure from. That's exploration at its core. Next was the spinner. They would use that to interact with the world, and I started to think, well, maybe critical successes could have them learn something about the world. I don't know. Next up was character sheets and attributes. And I thought, well, these provide bonuses to roles, which allow them to explore the world more. Right? It seemed tenuous at best. And that was really all I could think of that would actually tie into the goal. I mean, that was it. It was a big eye-opening moment for me. I realized that I was going to have to open my mind and bring this goal into other components if I really wanted that theme to carry across. So after a small amount of thinking, I came up with the absolute biggest piece of the game that I had been completely ignoring. It was roleplay. Players roleplay to interact with the world. How can we help it direct that to be fed more explicitly towards exploration? Those are what they're going to be spending probably 80% of their time doing. If this doesn't help garner exploration, then the game is a bust. So I decided, should we reward them? Rewards are one of the easiest ways to guide human behavior in general. And if so, should it be temporary rewards or permanent ones? Should they be gaining resources that they can spend on their adventure for temporary benefits? Or should it be stuff that is more for character progression, like upgrading their spinner so that there's less negative modifiers or better positive modifiers? Then I started to think of, what if information gained was actually explicitly stated? What if when they learned something, they got an exploration token? And what if when they got 3 of these, something they could easily hold in their hand while walking on the hike, they could use that to cash in to advance the story? Maybe they were dropped in an open world, an area that was just filled with stuff that they could go explore, but they knew their destination. In the example of the playtest, it would have been the Kobold Cave inside of the dragon skeleton. But maybe that content was gated. Maybe I would have said, you need 3 exploration tokens in order to gain access to this cave. And then after the player had gone around and learned about several different things in the world, they'd have those 3 tokens, and they'd change them in. And then maybe I could give them a short narrative, like, well, you learned number 1, the kobolds are a very ritualistic society. Number 2, they're very territorial, but they're highly superstitious. And number 3, they believe they talk to their god through the hallucinogenic mushrooms that you encountered earlier. You use those 3 things, the caste system, the superstition, and the speaking to their gods through the mushrooms, to access their cave. How do you do that? And then leave it up to the player to put the pieces together. Maybe upon discovering something groundbreaking or that would completely change the world as they knew it, maybe that's when we start giving out the more permanent upgrades. This is something that would happen maybe after finishing an entire map. Maybe stuff like that could also affect the attribute values and their relationships. I don't know. I started to also think about the attributes. Maybe those should be targeted towards more than just a unique and cool thing that player can do. Maybe they need to be more specific. For example, I used to have as an option, can control plants. Sounds interesting, full of possibilities, sure, but really vague. And not really tied into exploration at all. What if we changed that to become Queen of Jungle Flowers. That means she can understand and command everything that's inside of her domain. That's all of a sudden a lot more specific and character generating, and allows for opportunities for growth. The hypothesis here is that they'd be able to use the old mental models they've established of, oh, I am a queen of jungle flowers, to then apply that to the world around them in new contexts, to connect the dots. That would force them to have some sort of empathy with their character and build it out subconsciously. And it also allows for in-character explanations of the world around them as they do learn things. Instead of saying, oh yeah, it's a kobold and they run around painting themselves with tattoos and they talk to some deity. Instead, it could be foul creatures that remind you of large lizards that you frequently knew in the jungle, but these seem to be sentient. They decorate themselves with the pollen of strange plants you're unfamiliar with. And they babble to the skies after eating a foul plant, a foul mushroom that you've never seen in your jungle life before. It seems like the others, but fatter, purple, has a terrible smell. See how much more character that gives? How much more opportunity that gives the player to have built-in role-playing moments. How the world is built around their context, not the other way around. I was also considering having the option of altering their standing with the local peoples, kind of like a reputation system, but I cut that idea off pretty quick. I need to serve one central goal, and I realized I was going to be splitting it and dividing the player's attention. So this all seemed excellent. From a broad stroke perspective, it seems like I had gotten the game back on track. We had a central goal this time, one thing that I was trying to accomplish, exploration. And things were looking great. The thing is, even if these mechanics didn't end up working out, I at least felt like I was making progress on my goal of developing a game that communicated something, that accomplished something, and taught people. I started to drill down into other aspects of play that would be needed for the next playtest, and I realized that I've been feeling very awkward about one thing very particular, which is player failure. Now, this is a shortcoming I have as a GM in general, and I really feel like I need to overcome it. So I thought, what better of an opportunity than the game that I'm building to try and overcome this character flaw in myself. So I started to kind of think about why I had a hard time with players failing. And it kind of came down to, I just didn't know what would happen if they failed. I tend to talk a lot about interesting failure circumstances, but when it comes down to actually DMing the game, I find a hard time building that up. I'm also very nervous about players losing motivation after they lose. Well, what if they fail the fight and then they just get depressed? They don't want to play anymore. A lot of that, for me, came down to the idea of the hit point tracker. That seemed to be the central mechanic, measuring failure or success. At least in a lot of the instances in which I was having problems with. So I started to really look at that. Why does that exist in games? What does that serve? What emotion does that carry across? And I could really only think of two things. Number one, it introduces drama. Number two, it adds an explicit failure state. You drop down to 0 hit points, you're dead. Well, Prometheus is supposed to be a very upbeat game, filled with optimism and hope. So, do we really need an explicit failure state? This is a world for stories to thrive, not be snuffed out. That's created through drama, not failure states. So then the question became, how can I introduce drama into this world without failure states? Failure should carry consequences. However, if every meaningful action the player attempts can fail, and those failures carry consequences, then it only seems right that the player should have a way to mitigate that failure. Now, I'm going to be using the failure in a different sense here. When I say failure now, I'm not saying your character dies, the end. Instead, it's going to be you don't accomplish what you wanted, but the story's still going to move forward, and this is how we're going to do it. If every time the player spanned that spinner, it was with an understanding that things may not go their way, more than just, well, you don't open the door, tough luck. You try to open the door, but you can hear footsteps of guards approaching. You can tell you're not going to get it open by the time they get around. Stuff like that to introduce drama. So if they were going to suffer from potential negative consequences every single time they span that spinner, they need to have a way to mitigate that luck. This is a lesson I'm taking from Blood Bowl. At the surface, it's a very, very RNG-centered game. Your character can literally trip on the grass while it's running its way to a touchdown, with no one around them, and die. That doesn't seem very fair. But as you dig into Blood Bowl's systems, yes, it's still very RNG focused, but you start to understand there are a lot of systems you can use to manipulate that random number generation. You can choose which odds you enter into and which ones you don't. You can set up favorable circumstances in which it is more likely that your player is going to succeed instead of being mobbed by a bunch of members of the crowd just because they weren't cool enough. So I started to think, what if they could use those exploration tokens not only as ways to access content, but as ways to influence the rolls? What if they knew they were going to have a really hard roll? They could exchange an exploration token for a +2, and they could cite what they have learned in the past in order to help with that roll. Once again, feeding back into that idea of exploration and learning. The trickiest thing I could see with this was conversations. For some context, this is another DM failure I have. In a lot of conversations, the players I play with typically don't like to roleplay very much. Or if they do like to roleplay, they don't really know how to work the conversation in a way that benefits them. And I tend to just jump to the persuasion roll all the time. And at best, them making a solid argument just adds a bonus to the roll. I wanted this to be different. I wanted Prometheus to have meaningful interactions. That exploration should not just be of the world around them, but of the characters around them. I decided anytime you need to persuade someone, yes, we're going to have a roll. But you're only going to get one roll. And that roll is going to determine success or failure. In order to manipulate the odds of that roll, you can spend some time role-playing with the characters. Try and figure out what they like, what appeals to them, what makes them feel uneasy about you, and what fills them with suspicion. By using actual conversational tactics, players can explore these people's characters. And after they have learned enough about them, they can decide, I'm going to try to manipulate them this way. Maybe I can understand that this character is a coward. I think I can intimidate them into giving me what I want. Or this person is very goal-focused. I'm going to try and get on their side and sell myself as an asset and butter them up. That way they'll want to give me the information. It's not going to be as simple as, I'm a Dragonborn fighter, so I'm going to just intimidate everyone. It's going to be, what does that person respond to? Now, I recognize for a lot of players that I play with, especially my wife, that they're not going to be able to pick that out right off the top of their heads. That's a hard thing, and I don't blame anyone for not being able to intuitively understand infinite amounts of imaginative characters. So I'm going to have to be explicit about it. And I think that's fine. Saying things like, well, you seem to react very negatively to what you just said. Seems to be very sensitive about that subject. And that's fine. It's okay to give the players that extra amount of information, I think. They are being dropped into a strange world using only their imaginations to understand it. They're not actual people in this world. They need a little bit of help. With all that made, I really didn't want to move forward with any more design work until I had done another playtest. I felt like I had enough to try and see if that empty feeling was gone yet. So, in the meantime, I started working on the first map. Following my own design, my own rules, I built the map. Now, this map was really crappy. I just drew it on the train, and I am not a great artist. But it did communicate the world and the relationships inside of it. It had a couple of really cool benefits. Number one, it forced me to really envision the world, much more deeper than I ever did before. I really feel like I'm going to be using this for all of my GMing, not just what I do for Prometheus, because it was that incredibly useful of trying to come up with dramatic interactions between different factions within this area. Number two, it gave something real for the player to see. Now, instead of just being dropped into an imaginary place that they had no real context in, they had a map. They could explore it. They could take action on it. And that changed it from just being a participant in a story to being the hero in a tale. The effect was transformative and incredible. My wife chose to go explore the mushroom forest. And so that's where our next adventure is going to go. Notice how she made that choice. That wasn't me. That was her exploring the world. I just can't be more happy about that. Over the past few weeks and months, I've written out possible plot twists, characters, interesting things that can happen in that area. And I'm ready. I'm ready for the playtest. I'm very excited about it. And I have no idea what's going to happen.